October 5th, 1943, 18,000 feet above the Pacific, a Japanese Zero pulls into a steep vertical climb, a move that has killed American pilots for 2 years. The Japanese ace in the cockpit expects the familiar result: the heavy American fighter will stall, drop, and become an easy target. But the aircraft behind him does not fall away. It keeps climbing, engine roaring, propeller biting, closing the gap in thin air. In the Zero, confidence turns into disbelief. In the American cockpit, a rookie grips the stick of a brand new Grumman F6F Hellcat and follows his training. Stay with the Zero, do not panic, wait for the moment. At the top of the climb, the sky erupts with 50 caliber fire, and Japan's old rules break in seconds. Dawn spreads thin light across the Pacific. At 18,000 feet, the air is cold and dry, and every movement inside a fighter cockpit feels heavier than it should. Warrant Officer Toshiyuki Sueda banks his Mitsubishi Zero with calm precision. This is familiar ground for him. He has flown combat missions since the early months of the war, and 9 American fighters already burn behind his victories. The Zero responds lightly to every touch. Its controls feel alive, almost fragile, but that fragility has always been its strength. Below Sueda's formation, an American fighter climbs hard, nose up, engine straining. From above, its shape looks wrong: thick wings, broad fuselage. A bulky silhouette that reminds him of the Wildcat, the same American fighter he has beaten again and again. Those aircraft are predictable. They climb poorly, they bleed speed quickly. Once they follow a Zero upward, the outcome is almost guaranteed. For 2 years, Japanese pilots have relied on the same vertical tactic. The Zero pulls into a steep climb, forcing the heavier American fighter to chase. The American engine loses power as altitude increases. The aircraft slows, shudders, and finally stalls. At that moment, the Zero rolls over, dives, and fires into a helpless enemy. It is not fancy. It is not dramatic. It is reliable. Sueda assumes this fight will be no different. He angles his aircraft upward and commits to the climb. The Zero's lightweight frame surges higher, wings biting into the thin air. He waits for the American fighter to fall away, just as all the others have. Seconds pass, the expected stall does not come. Behind him, the American fighter is still climbing. Inside the American cockpit, Ensign Robert Duncan feels his body press back into the seat. This is only his second combat mission. His hands are tight on the stick, knuckles pale inside his gloves. The engine in front of him roars with a deep, steady sound that feels different from anything he has flown before. The Hellcat is new. The smell of oil and metal is still sharp. The gauges are alive, needles steady where older fighters would already be fading. Duncan does not think in words. He thinks in training habits drilled into him for months. Do not turn with the Zero. Use power, use climb, trust the aircraft. His instructors warned him that Japanese pilots would try this exact move. They told him the Hellcat was built for this moment. The climb continues through 14,000 feet, then 15. The Hellcat does not feel strained. Its massive radial engine keeps delivering power as if altitude means nothing. The propeller pulls hard, chewing through the air. Duncan realizes something important without fully naming it. He is not losing this fight. In Sueda's cockpit, something tightens in his chest. The American fighter should be gone by now. He glances over his shoulder and sees it, still there, nose up, climbing with him. This should not be possible. The Wildcat could never do this. None of the American fighters he knows could. The Zero reaches the upper part of the climb, where speed bleeds away, and the aircraft feels soft, almost floating. This is the moment Sueda usually owns. Instead, it becomes the moment he fears. His aircraft is slow. The sky around him feels empty and exposed, and the American is still climbing. At nearly 16,000 feet, both fighters are close to their limits. The Zero is light, but underpowered at this altitude. The Hellcat is heavy, but still strong. The balance is shifted without Sueda fully understanding how. He tries to roll over and dive, but the timing is wrong. The American is no longer below him. It is level. It is close. Duncan squeezes the trigger. 6 heavy machine guns fire at once. The sound is not a sharp burst, but a tearing roar, like fabric ripping at impossible speed. Tracer rounds streak forward, bright and violent against the pale sky. The convergence of the guns focuses the fire into a tight space. The Zero flies straight into it. The Japanese aircraft does not absorb damage. It breaks. The thin metal skin tears open. Fuel ignites. Fire flashes around the cockpit. In less than 3 seconds, the Zero stops being a fighter and becomes falling debris. Sueda never sees the end. His tactic, perfected through experience and repetition, has betrayed him. The rule he trusted most no longer applies. Duncan pulls his Hellcat through the top of the climb, heart pounding. Smoke drifts below him. He does not cheer. He barely has time to process what just happened. The radio crackles with confused voices. Other pilots are seeing the same thing. Zero's climbing and not escaping. Zero's burning where they expect victory. The single encounter does not end the war. But it changes something deep and permanent. For Japanese naval aviation, the Zero has always been the foundation. It was designed for range and maneuverability, built light to operate far from home bases across open ocean. Early in the war, this design made it terrifying. American fighters were heavier, slower to climb, and less agile. Japanese pilots trained long hours before the war, mastering energy fighting and precision gunnery. The Zero fit that doctrine perfectly. American pilots learned the hard way. Wildcats could survive punishment, but they could not chase a Zero upward. They could not turn tightly without losing speed. Many fights ended with Americans diving away simply to live. Survival became a victory. By 1942, American commanders understood that courage was not enough. They needed an aircraft that changed the rules. Not one that copied the Zero, but one that neutralized it. The Hellcat was the answer to that problem. It was built with a different philosophy. Instead of extreme lightness, it carried armor. Instead of delicate structure, it carried strength. Most importantly, it carried power. The engine at its heart was enormous, an 18-cylinder radial designed to keep producing power even when the air grew thin. Where older American fighters gasped, the Hellcat kept pulling. This mattered more than speed alone. Speed could be traded, turn rate could be avoided. Climb determined who controlled the fight. Whoever owned the vertical owned survival. Japanese pilots did not understand this shift at first. Reports came back in fragments, American fighters staying with them in climbs. American fighters diving away at will, American fighters surviving hits that should have been fatal. At first, these reports sounded like exaggeration or panic, but the pattern repeated. As more Hellcats arrived in the Pacific, encounters like Duncan's became common. Veteran Japanese pilots tried familiar tactics and found nothing worked as expected. The Zero could still turn tighter. It could still accelerate quickly at low speed. But every advantage now came with a cost. To turn, it had to slow. To climb, it had to expose itself. And every exposure invited overwhelming fire. The Hellcat did not need long bursts. Its guns were designed to kill quickly. Short controlled fire was enough. One pass. One climb. One decision. The American pilot did not need perfect aim. Volume and convergence did the work. Equally important, American pilots trusted their aircraft. They knew it could take hits. They knew it would bring them home. This confidence changed behavior. They attacked more aggressively. They stayed in fights longer. They climbed when told to climb instead of breaking away out of fear. For Japanese pilots, the psychological impact was crushing. The Zero demanded precision and restraint. One mistake could mean structural failure or fire. Against the Hellcat, mistakes multiplied. Even good hits often failed to stop the American aircraft. By the end of 1943, the skies over the Pacific no longer felt familiar to Japanese aviators. The air itself seemed hostile. Old instincts led them into danger. The radio calls changed in tone. Where once there was confidence, now there was warning. American fighters were no longer something to lure upward and destroy. They were something to avoid. The encounter on October 5th was not important because of who died or who survived. It mattered because it revealed the truth before either side fully understood it. The era of Zero dominance was ending, not gradually, but violently. For Robert Duncan, the fight was over in seconds. For Japanese naval aviation, it marked the beginning of a long collapse. The American fighter that climbed like a Zero but hit like nothing before had arrived. And the sky would never belong to Japan again. For most of the Pacific War, Japanese pilots believed they understood the sky. They trusted a set of rules learned through experience and confirmed again and again in combat. Lightweight meant agility. Agility meant survival. Altitude meant control. For 2 years, these rules had delivered victory. The Zero had been built around those ideas. Its designers stripped away anything that did not directly support range or maneuverability. Armor was removed. Self-sealing fuel tanks were ignored. Even structural strength was sacrificed. What remained was a fighter that could turn tighter and climb faster than almost anything it faced in the early war. In 1941 and 1942, this advantage was overwhelming. American fighters entering the war were not designed for this environment. They were heavier and slower to respond. Their engines lost power quickly as altitude increased. In combat, American pilots learned that chasing a zero upward almost always ended badly. The zero seemed to float while American aircraft struggled and stalled. Japanese pilots built their confidence on this imbalance. Training emphasized patience and control. Draw the enemy into a climb. Let physics do the work. Finish the fight on the way down. It worked against Wildcats, Buffaloes, and early naval fighters. Each victory reinforced the belief that the zero defined the limits of air combat in the Pacific. But these successes hid a dangerous assumption. Japanese doctrine assumed American aircraft would remain fundamentally the same. Incremental improvements were expected, not transformation. The zero was seen as a finished weapon, refined and perfected. Its weaknesses were known but accepted. Japanese planners believed skill and experience would always offset any enemy changes. Meanwhile, American pilots were learning different lessons. They did not see the zero as unbeatable, they saw patterns. They saw where fights were lost and why. They noticed that zeros avoided prolonged dives. They noticed how quickly Japanese fighters burned when hit. They noticed how fragile the airframe really was. Survival became the American priority. Pilots were told to live first and fight second. They were trained to dive away instead of turning, to work in teams, to accept that one pass was better than a drawn-out duel. These tactics kept them alive but did not give them control of the sky. By 1942, American commanders understood the core problem. It was not pilot courage or skill. It was energy. The zero controlled energy in the vertical. As long as Japanese pilots could climb away from danger, they dictated the fight. Breaking that control required something radical. It required an aircraft that could follow a zero upward and still fight at the top. Not briefly, not barely, but confidently. That meant power. More power than any carrier fighter had ever carried before. The Hellcat represented a rejection of old assumptions. It was not designed to dance with the zero. It was designed to hunt it. American engineers accepted that the aircraft would be large and heavy. They accepted that it would not turn as tightly. What mattered was that it could climb, dive, and absorb punishment while delivering overwhelming fire. This shift changed everything about air combat dynamics. A zero pilot who pulled into a climb expected safety. With the Hellcat, that climb became a trap. The higher the zero went, the weaker it became. The American fighter, built around a massive engine and reinforced structure, only grew more dangerous. Japanese pilots felt this change before they fully understood it. Early encounters produced confusion rather than fear. Reports described American fighters staying with them longer than expected, climbing higher than expected, surviving hits that should have ended the fight. At first, commanders dismissed these reports. They blamed fatigue or poor technique. But as encounters increased, patterns became impossible to ignore. The zero no longer owned the vertical. The fundamental rule of engagement had shifted. This loss of control forced Japanese pilots into impossible choices. If they stayed low, they faced faster American fighters that could dive on them repeatedly. If they climbed, they risked being followed and destroyed at altitude. If they tried to turn tightly, they bled speed and became easy targets for heavy guns. Every tactic now carried risk. The zero had been designed to exploit enemy mistakes. The Hellcat was designed to survive them. American pilots felt the difference immediately. In earlier aircraft, climbing after a zero required courage and luck. In the Hellcat, it required discipline. Pilots were told to trust the machine, to let the engine work, to avoid panic. Confidence replaced desperation. This confidence reshaped American behavior in the air. Pilots attacked with purpose instead of caution. They stayed together instead of scattering. They climbed to meet threats instead of diving away. Each successful engagement reinforced the belief that the aircraft would not fail them. For Japanese pilots, the psychological cost was severe. Experience and instinct betrayed them. Moves that once guaranteed advantage now led to sudden death. Veteran aces found themselves vulnerable in ways they had never known. Younger pilots, already rushed through shortened training programs, had little chance to adapt. The zero demanded finesse and restraint. The Hellcat demanded aggression and coordination. One rewarded patience, the other punished hesitation. By late 1943, Japanese air units faced a growing gap between doctrine and reality. Training manuals still described tactics that no longer worked. Replacement aircraft remained lightly built. Engines grew more powerful, but not enough to overcome the new imbalance. American industry, by contrast, delivered Hellcats in rising numbers. Each new squadron meant more pilots trained specifically to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. Combat reports were studied and fed back into training. The system learned quickly. This was not just a contest of machines. It was a contest of adaptation. The Zero had been built for a war Japan expected to fight. The Hellcat was built for the war that actually existed. As the months passed, Japanese pilots no longer asked how to defeat American fighters, they asked how to survive them. Radio calls reflected this change. Warnings replaced confidence. Requests for withdrawal replaced aggressive pursuit. The old rules were not just outdated, they were dangerous. The climb that once promised safety now promised exposure. The turn that once meant dominance now meant vulnerability. The sky itself had changed character. What had been a familiar battlefield became hostile terrain. This growing realization pushed the conflict toward its next stage. If the Zero could no longer dominate, Japan needed something new. Faster, stronger, better protected, but time and resources were running out. Meanwhile, American pilots prepared for larger battles ahead, confident that the balance had finally shifted. The Hellcat had not just matched the Zero, it had removed the foundation on which Japanese air power rested. The fighter that shattered Japanese confidence did not appear by accident. It was the product of hard lessons learned in blood and smoke during the first year of the Pacific War. Every burned Wildcat and every pilot loss fed a growing realization inside the United States Navy. The problem could not be solved with tactics alone. The aircraft itself had to change. By early 1942, American commanders faced a clear pattern. Their pilots could survive by diving away and fighting defensively, but they could not control the fight. The Zero dictated altitude and engagement distance. As long as Japanese pilots could climb beyond reach, they owned the sky. This was unacceptable for a navy that depended on carriers operating far from land. Reports from combat units began flowing back to engineers and planners. Gun camera footage showed American rounds striking Zeros and tearing them apart when hits were achieved. Intelligence officers studied a captured Zero recovered intact in the Aleutian Islands. For the first time, American engineers could examine the enemy fighter in detail. What they found confirmed everything pilots had suspected. The Zero was astonishingly light. Its structure was thin and delicate. There was no armor behind the pilot. The fuel tanks were not self-sealing. Control surfaces were responsive but fragile. The aircraft achieved its legendary performance by cutting weight wherever possible. It was a brilliant design for its time, but it survived by avoiding damage rather than absorbing it. American engineers made a deliberate choice. They would not try to outrun the Zero. They would not chase extreme lightness. Instead, they would build a fighter that could climb with the Zero while carrying protection and firepower the Japanese aircraft could not survive. This decision shaped every part of the new aircraft. It needed an engine powerful enough to maintain performance at altitude. It needed wings strong enough to handle high-speed dives. It needed armor to protect the pilot and vital systems. And it needed guns capable of destroying an enemy in a single pass. Grumman Aircraft Engineering took on the task with urgency. The company already had experience building naval fighters that could survive carrier operations and combat damage. But this project demanded more than refinement. It demanded transformation. The initial prototype flew with a powerful engine, but engineers quickly realized it was not enough. The aircraft performed well, but it did not dominate. Then came the critical change. The decision to install the massive Pratt and Whitney radial engine altered the design overnight. This engine delivered power on a scale no previous carrier fighter had possessed. With the new engine, the aircraft no longer felt constrained by altitude. Power remained strong as the air thinned. Climb rate improved dramatically. Acceleration became aggressive instead of gradual. The aircraft grew heavier, but the engine more than compensated. Test pilots returned from early flights with quiet confidence. The aircraft was stable. It was predictable. It responded smoothly even under stress. Unlike lighter fighters, it did not punish mistakes instantly. This mattered for combat pilots who would be flying long missions from moving decks over open ocean. Equally important was survivability. Engineers wrapped the cockpit in armor. Steel plates shielded the pilot from behind and below. Bullet-resistant glass protected the front. Fuel tanks were designed to seal themselves after being punctured. Oil lines and coolers were placed where damage would be less likely to cripple the aircraft. This approach changed pilot behavior. In earlier fighters, even a single hit could be fatal. In the new aircraft, pilots could take damage and keep fighting. Confidence grew not from bravado, but from experience. Pilots trusted that the aircraft would bring them home. The armament reflected the same philosophy. 6 heavy machine guns were mounted in the wings, each with generous ammunition. These guns were not chosen for finesse. They were chosen for effect. When fired together, they created a dense stream of projectiles that could tear through an aircraft in seconds. Engineers carefully positioned the guns so their fire converged at a specific distance. At that point, the combined firepower became overwhelming. A Zero caught in that zone had no margin for escape. The aircraft that emerged from this process was large and imposing. Pilots accustomed to smaller fighters were surprised by its size. On the ground, it looked more like a strike aircraft than a dogfighter. Some questioned whether it could truly fight agile opponents. Those doubts faded quickly in training. The aircraft climbed strongly, dove cleanly, and responded predictably at high speed. It did not spin easily. It did not stall abruptly. For carrier pilots operating in stressful conditions, these qualities were priceless. Training programs evolved alongside the aircraft. Pilots were taught new rules. Do not turn with the Zero. Use altitude and speed. Make one hard pass and climb away. Work in formations that supported each other. The aircraft was designed to make these tactics natural instead of risky. American pilot training expanded rapidly. By 1943, the United States was producing pilots at a pace Japan could not match. These pilots arrived in combat with hundreds of flight hours. They practiced gunnery until firing accurately became instinct. They trained in formation flying until mutual support felt automatic. This difference mattered as much as the aircraft itself. The Hellcat was forgiving. It allowed a rookie to survive mistakes that would have killed him in lighter fighters. Experience could be built instead of lost. Japanese intelligence slowly became aware of this shift. Reports mention American fighters that were larger and more powerful. Encounters described aircraft that could follow Zeros upward and dive away without fear. These reports reached command staffs already stretched thin by losses and logistics. Japan attempted to respond. New fighter designs were proposed. More powerful engines were planned. But resources were limited. Factories were under attack. Experienced pilots were already gone. Even the best designs could not be produced in sufficient numbers or train crews. Meanwhile, Hellcats flowed steadily to the fleet. New squadrons formed and trained specifically for carrier operations. Older aircraft were replaced. Tactics were refined with every engagement. The machine and the system supporting it worked together. Combat experience fed back into training. Training fed into tactics. Tactics fed into design improvements. The cycle accelerated. By the time Hellcats met Japanese fighters in large numbers, the outcome was no longer uncertain. The aircraft was not just better in one category. It was better balanced. It climbed well enough. It hit harder. It survived damage. And it was flown by pilots prepared for modern air combat. The Zero had been designed for a world where agility ruled and protection was optional. The Hellcat was designed for a world where firepower, endurance, and survival determined victory. This difference became impossible to ignore as battles grew larger. The era of individual duels gave way to coordinated engagements involving dozens of aircraft. In this environment, the Hellcat thrived. The answer to the Zero had been built not by copying it, but by understanding its limits. And once those limits were exposed, the sky began to belong to someone else. By late summer of 1943, the Hellcat was no longer a theory. It was real metal on real carrier decks, surrounded by nervous deck crews and pilots still learning its weight and power. The Pacific had not grown quieter. Japanese airfields still operated across hundreds of islands. Reconnaissance aircraft still searched for American task forces. The difference was that now, the United States Navy finally had a fighter meant to seize control instead of merely survive. The first Hellcat squadrons arrived quietly. There were no ceremonies, no announcements. Pilots climbed into unfamiliar cockpits and launched into humid air, unsure how the aircraft would behave when shot at. Training flights had been impressive, but combat had a way of revealing weaknesses no test could predict. Early missions focused on escort and patrol. Hellcats climbed above strike groups, circling like heavy guardians. Pilots quickly noticed how different the aircraft felt at altitude. The engine remained strong, controls stayed firm. Even when pushed hard, the aircraft did not feel fragile. This alone changed how pilots positioned themselves in the sky. The first real test came during strikes against isolated Japanese bases. These were not major fleet battles, but they were dangerous. Enemy aircraft still operated from these fields, and Japanese pilots remained aggressive. When Zeros appeared, Hellcat pilots followed their training. They did not turn tightly, they stayed fast, they stayed together. The results were immediate. In early engagements, Hellcats intercepted Japanese patrol aircraft and bombers with ease. Large flying boats and twin-engine aircraft that once required careful coordination were now destroyed in seconds. The Hellcats' guns proved devastating against slightly protected targets. Fires spread quickly. Wings failed. Aircraft vanished into the sea. Japanese pilots reacted with shock. These early encounters did not resemble the fights they remembered. American fighters were no longer hesitant. They attacked head-on. They stayed with targets through climbs. They absorbed defensive fire that would have crippled older aircraft. As confidence grew, Hellcat pilots pressed harder. Strafing runs destroyed aircraft on the ground before they could take off. Bombers caught unescorted rarely escaped. Each mission added experience. Each encounter refined tactics. The true test came when Hellcats met Zeros in significant numbers. These were not lone intercepts or brief skirmishes. These were organized defenses, with Japanese pilots confident in numbers and experience. In one such engagement, Hellcats approached an enemy island at dawn. Radar contact came early, and American fighters climbed to meet the threat. Japanese aircraft rose to intercept, confident they could gain altitude and dictate the fight. Instead, they found American fighters already there. The initial passes were fast and violent. Hellcats dove through Japanese formations, firing short bursts before climbing away. Zeros attempted to follow, but the American fighters matched them step for step. When Japanese pilots tried to turn tightly, Hellcats refused to follow, instead diving away and returning with speed. Losses mounted quickly on the Japanese side. Pilots who had survived dozens of earlier battles found themselves unable to escape. Their aircraft could still maneuver, but every maneuver bled energy. Every loss of speed invited another pass from above. For American pilots, this was the moment belief hardened into certainty. The aircraft did what it promised. It climbed when asked. It accelerated when needed. It survived hits that would have meant death in earlier fighters. Equally important was coordination. Hellcats flew in disciplined formations. Wingmen watched each other constantly. If a Zero latched onto one aircraft, another dove in to break the attack. The sky was no longer a collection of individual duels. It was a moving structure of mutual support. Japanese tactics struggled against this change. Their doctrine emphasized individual skill and precise timing. Formation tactics existed, but the Zero had been designed for flexibility, not rigid teamwork. Against Hellcats working together, lone brilliance mattered less with every engagement. As battles expanded, Japanese losses grew heavier. Reports described American fighters that could not be shaken, fighters that climbed instead of fleeing, fighters that struck once and destroyed instantly. The psychological effect was severe. Japanese pilots began to hesitate. Hesitation in air combat is deadly. Where once they attacked aggressively, now they questioned angles and distances. That pause was enough for Hellcats to strike. American pilots felt the opposite effect. Each successful mission reinforced confidence. Rookies learned quickly because the aircraft allowed them to survive long enough to learn. Veterans pushed boundaries, refining tactics that maximized advantage. Carrier commanders took note. Hellcats were assigned more responsibility. They flew combat air patrols farther from the fleet. They escorted strike aircraft deeper into enemy territory. They began to dominate the airspace over target areas. Japanese airfields became increasingly vulnerable. Without control of the sky, aircraft on the ground were easy targets. Hellcats strafed parked bombers and fighters, destroying them before they could launch. Each destroyed aircraft reduced Japan's ability to contest the next battle. The air war began to tilt visibly. Where earlier American strikes faced heavy interception, now resistance thinned. Japanese pilots were still brave. They still attacked. The bravery could not overcome physics and firepower. As weeks passed, the Hellcats' reputation spread through both sides. American pilots trusted it, Japanese pilots feared it. Radio traffic reflected the change. Warnings replaced confidence. Calls for help went unanswered as formations broke under pressure. By the time larger fleet engagements approached, the Hellcat had already proven itself. It had survived real combat. It had defeated experienced enemies. It had shown that American air power could seize and hold altitude. This shift set the stage for battles on a scale the Pacific had not yet seen. When carrier fleets finally clashed in full strength, the outcome would not depend on isolated heroics. It would depend on systems, training, and machines built for sustained dominance. The Hellcat had passed its trial by fire. What came next would turn local victories into something far more decisive. By the middle of 1944, the Pacific sky was crowded with aircraft on a scale never seen before. Carrier task forces stretched across the horizon, steel decks packed with fighters, bombers, fuel, and men who knew a decisive moment was approaching. The Hellcat was no longer new. It was everywhere. Its shape had become familiar to American pilots and deeply feared by Japanese air crews. Japanese command understood the danger but had no choice except to fight. The coming battle was meant to stop the American advance and restore control of the air. Carriers were assembled. Aircraft were gathered from every available base. Pilots were assigned regardless of experience. Many were young, rushed through training, and sent forward with little more than basic instruction. They climbed into Zeros that still turned well, but now felt outdated and fragile. American carriers waited with a different mood. Their decks were crowded with Hellcats flown by pilots who had trained for hundreds of hours. They trusted radar. They trusted their formations. Most of all, they trusted their aircraft. The Hellcat had already proven it could climb, fight, and survive. What remained was to see if it could do so on a massive scale. When radar screens first lit up with incoming Japanese aircraft, there was no panic. Fighter directors calmly vectored Hellcats into position. Engines roared to life. One by one, fighters lifted off the decks and climbed into the morning sky. Instead of rushing forward blindly, they formed layers at different altitudes, waiting. The Japanese strike groups approached in long, loose formations. Many pilots believed they were flying into a decisive moment that would change the war. They expected resistance, but not domination. As they climbed, they saw American fighters already above them. The first interceptions were fast and brutal. Hellcats dove through the Japanese formations, firing short controlled bursts before climbing away. Bombers burst into flames. Fighters disintegrated mid-air. The American pilots did not linger. They followed their training and returned upward, preserving energy and position. Japanese pilots tried to respond with familiar tactics. They attempted to turn tightly to shake attackers. They pulled into climbs to escape. Each move failed. Hellcats matched their climbs and refused their turns. When Japanese aircraft slowed, they were destroyed. When they dove, they were pursued and cut apart. Confusion spread quickly. Formations broke. Radios filled with overlapping calls and warnings. Pilots searched for leaders who were already gone. The sky became a series of isolated struggles rather than coordinated attacks. American pilots experienced something very different. Their formations held. Wingmen stayed close. If one aircraft was threatened, another intervened. The Hellcat's stability made gunnery easier. Pilots fired less and hit more. Ammunition lasted. Fuel remained. As waves of Japanese aircraft were destroyed, new waves followed. Each met the same fate. Hellcats climbed, intercepted, fired, and climbed again. The cycle repeated until the sky was littered with falling aircraft and drifting smoke. Japanese carriers waited far away, listening to reports grow darker by the minute. Aircraft failed to return. Pilots reported overwhelming opposition. Some aircraft turned back before reaching the fleet. Others pressed on and vanished. By midday, the scale of destruction was undeniable. Japanese air power was being erased faster than it could be committed. The American fleet remained largely untouched. Anti-aircraft fire was minimal because enemy aircraft rarely came close enough to attack. For American pilots, the battle felt almost unreal. There was danger, but it was controlled. The Hellcat absorbed hits from defensive gunners and kept flying. Pilots landed, refueled, rearmed, and launched again. The machine worked. The system worked. Japanese pilots who survived the engagements described a nightmare. They spoke of American fighters appearing from above, firing once, and disappearing. They spoke of aircraft that could not be shaken, aircraft that climbed endlessly, aircraft that seemed immune to damage. This battle marked the complete collapse of Japanese carrier aviation. Years of training, experience, and tradition were destroyed in hours. The Zero, once the symbol of dominance, was helpless against a fighter that matched its climb and exceeded it in every other way. The kill ratios were staggering. For every Hellcat lost, many Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The numbers were so uneven that even American commanders were surprised. What had once been a dangerous contest became a rout. Beyond the immediate losses, the strategic impact was devastating. Japan could not replace trained pilots at this rate. Aircraft production could not keep pace. Fuel shortages worsened. Morale collapsed. American forces, by contrast, emerged stronger. Pilots gained experience without catastrophic losses. Tactics were confirmed and refined. The Hellcat proved it could dominate not just isolated engagements, but entire battles. From this point forward, Japanese air units rarely controlled the conditions of a fight. They reacted instead of initiating. They avoided engagement when possible. When forced to fight, survival became the goal rather than victory. The phrase that would later be remembered captured the imbalance perfectly. What had once been fierce air combat now resembled target practice. The Hellcat turned skill and coordination into overwhelming advantage. This was the climax of the Hellcat story in the air war. Not because it was the end, but because it proved beyond doubt that Japanese air superiority was finished. The sky no longer belonged to those who had ruled it in the early years of the war. What followed was not a return to balance, but a long decline. Japanese aircraft still flew. Pilots still fought. But the outcome was no longer in question. The Hellcat had broken the system that sustained the Zero. By late 1944, the change in the Pacific sky was complete. Japanese aircraft still appeared, but they no longer arrived with confidence. They came cautiously, often in small numbers, and rarely stayed long. American carrier task forces moved almost freely across the ocean, protected by layers of Hellcats circling above them from dawn to dusk. Control of the air was no longer contested. It was enforced. For Japanese pilots, survival had become uncertain the moment they took off. Fuel shortages limited training. Replacement pilots arrived with only a fraction of the experience their predecessors once had. Many had never fired their guns in combat before their first encounter with the Hellcat. They faced opponents who not only flew better machines, but who also worked as disciplined teams guided by radar and clear command structure. The Hellcat thrived in this environment. It was not a fragile tool that demanded perfect handling. It was a working aircraft built for war. Pilots flew long missions in brutal heat and violent weather. They landed hard on pitching decks. They took damage from flak and gunfire. Again and again, the aircraft brought them home. As American forces pushed westward, Hellcats escorted bombers deeper into enemy territory. They covered amphibious landings where thousands of troops poured onto hostile beaches. Japanese aircraft attempting to attack these landings were intercepted far from their targets. Many never reached firing range. The Zero, once feared across the Pacific, now struggled even to reach American formations. It could still turn sharply and accelerate at low speed, but these strengths mattered little when the Hellcat controlled altitude and speed. Japanese pilots learned to fear the sound of American engines above them. Once that sound appeared, escape was unlikely. Some Japanese commanders attempted new tactics. They tried surprise attacks at low altitude. They tried massed assaults to overwhelm defenses. They tried night operations and desperate measures. None of it restored balance. The Hellcat adapted to each new threat. Variants equipped for night fighting hunted in darkness. Aircraft carrying bombs and rockets destroyed airfields and supply depots, reducing the enemy ability to fight at all. The impact went beyond the air. With Japanese air power broken, American naval forces operated with increasing freedom. Supply lines were protected. Bombardments were accurate. Ground forces advanced under constant air cover. Every island taken further reduced Japan's ability to resist. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Hellcats described a sense of helplessness. They spoke of aircraft that could not be shaken, of guns that destroyed instantly, of enemy pilots who seemed calm and methodical, never chasing blindly, never exposing themselves unnecessarily. The Hellcat became the backbone of American naval aviation not because it was the fastest or the most elegant, but because it was complete. It combined power, protection, firepower, and reliability in a way no enemy aircraft could match. It allowed pilots to make mistakes and learn from them. It rewarded discipline and teamwork. American training programs reached full strength during this period. New pilots arrived with hundreds of flight hours. They practiced gunnery until accuracy was second nature. They learned formation flying until spacing and timing felt instinctive. When they entered combat, they did so confident that both their skills and their aircraft would carry them through. Japanese training, by contrast, collapsed under pressure. Fuel shortages limited flight time. Experienced instructors were dead or reassigned. New pilots learned just enough to take off and land. Facing Hellcats in combat, they had little chance to survive long enough to gain experience. The result was a widening gap that no courage could bridge. Each engagement removed more Japanese pilots and aircraft. Each month made recovery less possible. The war in the air became one-sided. By 1945, Japanese aircraft rarely challenged American carriers directly. When they did, their life expectancy was measured in seconds. Hellcats intercepted, destroyed, and returned to patrol with fuel still in their tanks. The sky belonged to the United States. The numbers told the story clearly. Thousands of enemy aircraft were destroyed in aerial combat by Hellcats. Hundreds more were destroyed on the ground. Against these losses, only a small number of Hellcats were lost to enemy fighters. No other carrier fighter achieved such a ratio. But numbers alone do not explain the Hellcat's impact. What mattered most was what it allowed American pilots to do. It allowed them to fight aggressively without desperation. It allowed them to control when and how battles occurred. It allowed them to come home. For Japanese commanders, the appearance of the Hellcat marked the moment they understood the war could no longer be won. Industrial capacity, training systems, and technical innovation had combined into something they could not match. Even new aircraft designs could not be fielded in time or in numbers that mattered. The phrase that echoed through intercepted radio calls captured the realization perfectly. American fighters climbing like zeros. It was not a complaint about tactics. It was an admission that the foundation of Japanese air superiority had been destroyed. The Hellcat did not simply defeat the Zero, it erased the assumptions that had made the Zero dominant. It proved that agility alone could not win a modern air war. Protection, firepower, and sustained performance mattered more. When the war ended in August 1945, Hellcats still filled American carrier decks. They had escorted bombers, defended fleets, hunted submarines, attacked ground targets, and destroyed enemy aircraft wherever they appeared. They had done everything asked of them. After the war, the Hellcat quickly gave way to jet aircraft. Its time in frontline service was brief, but its legacy endured. Museums displayed its broad wings and heavy guns. Pilots who flew it remembered an aircraft that never betrayed them. Japanese veterans, when asked years later what American weapon they feared most, often named the same aircraft. Not because it was invincible, but because it represented something final. Once it appeared, the outcome of the air war was no longer in doubt. The Hellcat was built in enormous numbers, each one a product of American industry working at full speed. Together, they formed a wall in the sky that no enemy could break. They carried the weight of victory not through elegance, but through reliability and power. Toshiyuki Sueda's fatal mistake on October 5, 1943, was not tactical. It was assumption. He believed the enemy could not change fast enough. He believed the rules he knew would always apply. He was wrong. The Grumman F6F Hellcat proved that adaptation could be faster than tradition. That industry could outpace experience. That training and design together could reshape an entire war. When Japanese pilots radioed that American fighters were climbing like zeros, they were announcing the end of an era. The sky had changed hands, and once it did, it never returned.